500 men were about to take control of the strait that, 5 centuries later, would still decide the price of oil around the world. Island of Hormuz, 1507. From the decks of 6 Portuguese ships, the men can see a walled city, wealthy, fortified. And they know that behind those walls, the defenders outnumber them more than 10 to 1. There are no reinforcements coming. There is no retreat. And before the sun goes down that day, the city will be theirs. That strip of water goes by another name today, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of all the oil consumed on this planet passes through it. A sea corridor about 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, and nearly every barrel of oil leaving the Persian Gulf has to squeeze through it. Iran threatens to close it periodically as a geopolitical weapon, and every time that threat surfaces, the price of oil moves worldwide. 5 centuries before any of that, a European nation of fewer than 2 million people had already figured out exactly what that strait was worth, and they turned it into a money machine that ran for over 100 years. The man commanding those 6 ships is named Afonso de Albuquerque. His enemies called him the Lion of the Sea. In Portugal, he'd go down in history under a different nickname, the Caesar of the East. And what separates Albuquerque from the other commanders of his era isn't courage. Courage was cheap in that world. Every Portuguese captain was willing to die at sea. What separates Albuquerque is an idea. 9 years earlier, Vasco da Gama had rounded Africa and reached India for the first time. All of Portugal celebrated. There was finally a direct route to the east, with no dependence on the Arab, Persian, and Venetian middlemen who had spent centuries multiplying the price of every peppercorn that reached Europe. While everyone else celebrated finding a new road, Albuquerque looked at the same map and came to a different conclusion. Opening one road wasn't enough. You had to close all the others. Because as long as the old routes kept working, the middlemen would stay alive, keep competing, keep driving down the price of Portuguese goods. So he draws up a plan and formally presents it to the king, a plan almost absurdly ambitious for the size of the country. There are, he argues, 3 places on Earth where trade between East and West is forced to pass through because geography leaves no alternative. Malacca in Southeast Asia, controlling the passage between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea, controlling the route that feeds Egypt and the Mediterranean. And Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, controlling everything moving up into Persia and overland toward Europe. 3 points, not 3 countries, not 3 continents, 3 doors. And Albuquerque's argument is that whoever holds the doors doesn't need to conquer anything else. And of the 3, Hormuz might have been the most valuable, which is strange because the island itself had nothing, no meaningful agriculture, no natural resource worth wanting, and most improbable of all, almost no drinking water. Nearly every drop consumed there had to be shipped in from the mainland. An enormously wealthy city built on a piece of rock that couldn't even give water to the people living on it. Because Hormuz didn't need any of that. Hormuz had position. Every ship that wanted in or out of the Persian Gulf passed through there. Every load of spice coming from India bound for Persia, Mesopotamia, and onward to Europe passed through there. The city had grown so rich off that natural toll that a saying circulated through the trading world of the era: if the world were a ring, Hormuz would be the jewel. A quick note on the name before we move on. Hormuz is a version of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion that existed centuries before Islam reached the region. The god of light, lending his name to the most coveted strip of sea on the planet. And in 1507, Albuquerque decides to take it, with a force that, on paper, had no chance whatsoever. And we're back on the decks of those 6 ships. Now you understand what Albuquerque is looking at. It isn't just some city. It's the jewel in the ring. But the math of the situation is hard to defend rationally. Albuquerque has 6 ships, roughly 500 men. Portuguese chronicles from the period, written by chroniclers like Gaspar Correa and João de Barros, describe a defending force in the tens of thousands, with estimates running as high as 20, 30,000 fighters. Worth a note of historical honesty here. Enemy troop numbers in 16th century chronicles tend to be inflated, not necessarily deliberate lies. It's a consistent pattern in the historiography of the era, where making the enemy bigger made the victory bigger. The real number was probably lower. But even by the most conservative estimate, the Portuguese were catastrophically outnumbered. So how do 500 men take a city defended by thousands? The answer isn't heroism, and it isn't luck. It's artillery. Portugal had spent decades developing something almost no other naval power had. Ships designed from the keel up to carry heavy cannon and fire broadsides from the sides at range. On the other side, the vessels defending Hormuz were numerous and fast, but built for trade and for close quarters fighting. The naval combat logic they knew was get close, board, fight on deck with sword and bow. Against heavy naval artillery, that logic simply didn't exist anymore. This wasn't one fleet fighting another fleet. It was one fleet shooting at boats that were still trying to get close enough to start fighting. When the battle opens, Portuguese cannon shred the defense of Hormuz before most of the defenders can even reach the enemy ships. And then comes the second element, absolute aggression. Albuquerque doesn't wait, doesn't maneuver for position, doesn't set up a prolonged siege. Siege would be suicide because he didn't have the men to sustain one or the supplies to wait it out. He attacks immediately with everything he has, betting that concentrated violence and the psychological shock of naval bombardment would break the will to resist before that numerical advantage could ever be organized and used. The battle is short and brutal. The Sultanate of Hormuz capitulates. And now comes the part almost nobody expects, because you already know how this usually ends in the 16th century. The city falls, the victor walks in, and what follows is sacking, slaughter, the ruler deposed or executed, the entire administration replaced with people from the conquering country. That's how nearly every European empire operated in that era. Albuquerque does none of it. He leaves the Sultan on the throne, doesn't destroy the city, doesn't replace the administration, doesn't install a Portuguese government. He leaves Hormuz being governed by exactly the same people who governed it before, with one condition. From now on, Hormuz pays tribute to Portugal and recognizes Portuguese sovereignty over the strait. And once you understand the logic behind that, it's almost frightening in how efficient it is. Portugal didn't have people. A country of barely over 1 million had no way to administer a populous city on the other side of the world, and Albuquerque knew that better than anyone. But he'd also work out something else. He didn't need to. A destroyed city generates no revenue. A prosperous one does. So he lets Hormuz stay rich, stay busy, keep doing exactly what it had always done, except now a cut of every coin moving through it goes to Lisbon. This wasn't territorial conquest. It was capturing flow. But there's a part of this story that rarely gets told, and it's the part that reveals the most about who Albuquerque actually was, because he won the battle and lost Hormuz anyway. He starts building the fortress right there in 1507, exactly as planned. But the captains of his own fleet refused to go along with it. They wanted to head back to India, wanted to split the profits from the cargo, wanted anything other than sweating on a barren island, building a wall for a commander obsessed with a theory about maps. Several of them simply desert. They take the ships and leave. Without enough fleet, without enough men, without a finished fortress, Albuquerque is forced to do the one thing a man like him hated most: retreat. He abandons Hormuz in 1508, the most brilliant conquest of his career, collapsing not because of the enemy, but because of his own subordinates. Most commanders would have swallowed that defeat and moved on with their lives. Albuquerque spends the next several years climbing. He takes Goa, he takes Malacca, the second of the 3 doors in his plan. He becomes governor of Portuguese India with authority nobody could challenge anymore. And in 1515, with enough power that he no longer depends on any captain's goodwill, he goes back 8 years later to the same piece of rock to finish the job. And what he builds this time isn't just a fortress. Real quick, if you're enjoying watching how 500 men reshaped the geopolitics of the world, drop a like. That's what tells YouTube to show this video to more people. This time, nobody disobeys. Albuquerque builds a stone fortress, heavily gunned, positioned so its cannon can reach any vessel attempting to cross the strait. And it isn't a symbolic outpost, it's a toll booth. From that moment on, crossing Hormuz stops being a question of navigation. It becomes a question of permission. The Portuguese system was blunt. Any ship that wanted through the strait needed a permit issued by Portugal and had to pay for it. Flag didn't matter. Arab, Persian, Indian, Ottoman, Venetian, everyone fell under the same rule. If you had the permit, you passed and went on your way. If you didn't, you were intercepted. If you resisted, you were sunk. And here's what that actually means. Portugal had found a way to collect taxes from people who weren't Portuguese subjects. Merchants who had never set foot in Europe. Kingdoms that owed Lisbon nothing. Empires far larger and far richer than Portugal, all paying every year because the alternative was not sailing. It wasn't taxing a product. It wasn't taxing a people. It was taxing geography. For over a century, that arrangement pours a quantity of wealth into the Portuguese crown that's hard to even measure. Hormuz becomes one of the most profitable holdings in the entire Portuguese empire. Now think about the size of the operation Portugal was running at that moment. Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, Goa on the coast of India, Malacca in Southeast Asia, outposts along the entire coast of Africa, and Brazil across the Atlantic. 3 continents simultaneously. An operation that size requires a massive country behind it. A populous empire with deep reserves of manpower, capable of pouring people and soldiers into any point on the map. Portugal in the 16th century had somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, fewer people than live in plenty of mid-sized cities today. It wasn't the largest empire by territory. It wasn't the largest by population. It wasn't remotely close. It was almost certainly the most geographically scattered the world had ever seen. And it worked not in spite of being small, but precisely because it had understood that size wasn't the thing that mattered. Don't conquer territories, conquer doors. And that arrangement runs for 115 years, until 2 enemies with absolutely nothing in common, who didn't speak the same language, didn't follow the same religion, didn't even want the same thing, figure out that they needed each other. What brings Portugal down at Hormuz isn't a greater power. It's 2 adversaries who wanted completely different things, and alone never could have pulled it off. On the Persian side is Shah Abbas I, probably the most capable ruler of the Safavid dynasty, the man who rebuilt the Persian army, centralized the administration, and turned Persia back into a regional power people respected. To him, the situation at Hormuz is a structural humiliation. A foreign power from the other side of the world controlling the entrance to the Gulf that touches Persian soil, charging tolls on Persian trade for over 100 years. He wants the strait back, but he has an obvious problem. Persia is a land power. It has no navy capable of facing gunned Portuguese ships. On the other side is the English East India Company, a private enterprise with its own fleet, its own capital, and its own colonial ambitions, trying to break the Portuguese and Iberian monopoly on Asian trade. The English want direct commercial access to Persia, and as long as Portugal controls Hormuz, that access runs through Portuguese permission. They have exactly what the Persians lack: warships capable of going toe-to-toe with the Portuguese fleet. And the Persians have exactly what the English lack: a land army to take and hold the fort. In 1622, that alliance happens. English ships neutralize Portuguese naval capability in the region. Persian troops surround the fort by land, and the Portuguese garrison does what was expected of it. It holds. That fort had been built by Albuquerque for exactly this: stone walls, heavy artillery, commanding position. Inside, trained men, well armed, defending a fortification designed to withstand a siege. You're probably picturing what comes next. Assault after assault, walls giving way, hand-to-hand fighting, the fort taken by force. That's not what happened. What brought down the most strategic fortress of the Portuguese Empire wasn't cannon and it wasn't an army. It was thirst. Remember that strange detail I mentioned at the start? The enormously wealthy city built on a piece of rock that couldn't give water to the people living on it. Every drop of water that fort consumed had to be brought in from outside, by sea. And in 1622, the sea belonged to the English. Surrounded by land and blockaded by water, that fortress had a clock running against it from the first hour of the siege, and no wall in the world solves that. The same geography that made Hormuz the most valuable point in world trade was, the entire time, the fatal weakness of anyone trying to hold it. Albuquerque had built the perfect fortress in the worst possible place to defend one. Portugal loses Hormuz in 1622 and never gets it back. But the strait doesn't lose importance along with them, quite the opposite. 4 centuries later, something is discovered in that gulf that makes the spice trade look like pocket change. After 1622, the strait changes hands and changes importance several times over the centuries. The Persians take back control. The English establish commercial presence and later colonial influence across the whole Gulf region. Empires rise and fall around that water. And then in the 20th century, something happens that nobody in 1507 could have predicted. Oil is discovered in the Persian Gulf, in quantities that redefine the world economy. Suddenly, the same sea corridor that was worth gold because of pepper and cinnamon is valuable again, but now for a reason that's infinitely bigger. Today, roughly 20% of all the oil consumed in the world crosses that strait. On some days, more than 20 million barrels move through it. And to give you a sense of the scale, while you're watching this video, right now, there are tankers crossing the exact same corridor of water Albuquerque blocked with 6 ships. At its narrowest, the usable shipping lane is only a couple of miles wide, a piece of sea smaller than most cities, and through it moves the energy that runs factories, aircraft, hospitals, and most of the global economy. And on one side of it sits Iran. That's why every time tension between Iran and the West rises, the same threat resurfaces: close the Strait of Hormuz. It isn't empty rhetoric. It's the exact application of the same logic Afonso de Albuquerque wrote in a letter to the King of Portugal over 500 years ago. The products changed. The logic didn't change at all. You don't need to dominate an entire continent. You just need to control the door. And the island of Hormuz is still there. Today it's Iranian territory, and it's become a tourist destination, known mainly for its red sand beaches, the result of iron oxide in the soil, which stains the water in shades that look unreal in photographs. And among the island's attractions, still standing, eaten away by salt and time, are the ruins of the Portuguese fort. The same fortress Albuquerque came back to build in 1515 after losing that island to his own men. Iranian tourists walk today through the ruins of a fortress raised by a Western power on a piece of land belonging to the country now in open conflict with the West. For centuries, kings believed power meant accumulating land. Albuquerque bet on a different idea. Instead of conquering cities, he conquered passages. Instead of taxing subjects, he taxed geography. He died convinced he'd understood something the others hadn't. 5 centuries later, with a different product, different flags, and different weapons, the entire world is still fighting over that exact same piece of water. Empires change, products change, choke points don't. If this video was worth your time, drop a like. That's what tells YouTube whether a video is any good. Subscribe. There's a lot more history like this coming. Thanks for sticking around.